It was supposed to be an ordinary road trip. 4 friends, a long stretch of highway, and a promise to enjoy the freedom of the open road. We were headed from Denver, Colorado to Los Angeles, California, excited for the adventures ahead. The journey was meant to be filled with laughter, great music, and a few pit stops along the way. Little did we know, this trip would turn into something far more terrifying than any of us could have imagined. It was the middle of the night when we left Denver, the streets quiet and the air crisp. The car's headlights barely pierced the thick fog that had begun to settle over the highway. We had already driven for 10 hours and were starting to feel the toll of the road. The fatigue was setting in, but none of us complained. We were all excited to get to California and enjoy some much-needed time off. The car, an old sedan that had seen better days, hummed steadily along the deserted road. We were passing through a remote part of Colorado. Nothing but empty stretches of highway on either side, the occasional darkened building, and the eerie silhouettes of trees looming like shadows in the distance. "We need to stop soon," Sam, who was driving, said with a yawn. "I can barely keep my eyes open." "Yeah, same here," replied Rachel from the back seat. "I'm starving too." We had planned to stop at a diner or gas station, but the highway seemed endless, and there was no sign of life. It was already past midnight, and we were all getting anxious. The only light we could see was from our headlights, and the fog was growing thicker with every mile. Just as we were starting to get frustrated, I saw something ahead, a dim, flickering light. My heart skipped a beat, a sign of life. Finally, as we drew closer, the shape of a diner emerged through the fog, the glow of its neon lights flickering on and off like a beacon in the darkness. "Thank God," I muttered. "I'm starving." "Cindy's Diner," Rachel read aloud as we pulled into the parking lot. The neon sign was faded, the letters peeling, but it was still a sign of hope in an otherwise barren stretch of highway. The diner itself looked old, almost abandoned. The windows were covered in grime, and the door creaked as Sam opened it. Inside, the air was stale, and the flickering light overhead cast long shadows across the empty tables. There was an unsettling silence, a feeling of stillness that made me uneasy. The place looked like it hadn't been open in years. A man stood behind the counter, his back turned to us. He was tall, with a hunched posture and an almost unnatural stillness about him. He wore a faded apron, and his hair, though white, was greasy and unkempt. When he turned to face us, his eyes glowed with an odd intensity, an unnatural, almost otherworldly gleam that sent a chill down my spine. "Come on in," he said, his voice raspy and low, like he hadn't spoken in years. He gestured toward a booth in the corner. "Sit wherever you like." We exchanged nervous glances but reluctantly sat down at the booth. The diner was silent, the air thick with tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the late hour, the isolation, or maybe it was the strange man behind the counter. Whatever it was, I had an uneasy sense that we were intruding on something we shouldn't. The man didn't say a word as he shuffled to the kitchen, and we sat there in silence. The diner was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of other customers, no clattering of plates, no hum of a refrigerator. Just the sound of the wind howling outside, pressing against the walls of the diner. "What do you think?" Rachel whispered, her eyes darting around the room. "It feels like we're in some kind of ghost town." "I don't know," Sam replied, glancing at the door. "It's really creepy. It's like we're the only people in the world right now." We all nodded, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on us. I looked around, trying to distract myself. The walls were covered in old, yellowing photos, but they looked strange, distorted and blurry, as if something was off about them. The dim lighting made it hard to see clearly, but I could swear some of the faces in those photos seemed to be watching us. "I think I see something in the kitchen," Rachel said suddenly, pointing toward the back of the diner. "Is there someone in there?" I looked in the direction she was pointing, but there was no one visible. The kitchen was dark, and the man had disappeared into the shadows. A gust of wind rattled the door, and I shivered involuntarily. "Just relax, guys," I said, trying to shake off the growing feeling of dread. "It's just a diner, we're fine." But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't help but feel more and more on edge. The stillness in the air, the strange man, the feeling that we were being watched, it was all too much. I was about to suggest that we leave when the man returned, holding a tray of food in his hands. He placed it in front of us without a word, his eyes never leaving our faces. The food was unappetizing, bland and greasy, with a strange metallic taste that I couldn't place. Despite our reservations, we all dug in, trying to ignore the strange feeling in our stomachs. Just as I took a bite of my food, the lights above us flickered, and the air grew colder. The power in the diner went out completely. For a few seconds, everything was pitch black, and I couldn't see a thing. My heart began to race. I felt a sudden sense of claustrophobia, as if the walls of the diner were closing in on me. "Guys," I whispered, feeling for my phone in the darkness. "Did anyone bring a flashlight?" There was no response. I could hear Sam breathing heavily beside me, and Rachel was muttering something under her breath. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, rattling the windows. Suddenly, Rachel's voice broke through the silence. "Do you see that?" I turned toward her, but the flashlight from her phone barely illuminated the room. But then I saw it on the wall, just behind the booth. There were stains, dark, almost black stains. They looked like old blood, dried and crusted against the pale yellow wallpaper. My heart stopped. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I could feel my legs go numb, my body frozen in place. Sam tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't move. He struggled to stand, but it was as if something was holding him in place. The door creaked open again, and I froze. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the dim light outside. It was a woman, her long hair wild and disheveled, and her clothes were torn. Her face was pale, and blood dripped from her eyes, staining her cheeks. She moved toward us slowly, her steps deliberate and heavy. I could feel the air grow colder as she got closer. Her eyes, those deep red eyes, were fixed on us, her lips curling into a twisted smile. Who are you?" Sam choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, her fingers long and claw-like, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. I could feel a strange pressure in my chest, as if my body was being pulled toward her. I wanted to run, but my legs were still frozen. Then the old man appeared again, standing in the doorway with a sinister smile. His eyes glowed, and he chuckled softly. "Don't bother trying to leave," he said, his voice like gravel. "No one ever leaves here." Suddenly, I felt the overwhelming need to get out. I couldn't explain it, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. Sam, still struggling to move, finally broke free and shoved me toward the door. We scrambled out of the booth and rushed for the exit. The woman was right behind us, moving faster now, her feet barely touching the ground. As we burst through the door, we heard a bone-chilling laugh echo through the diner. I turned just long enough to see her figure disappearing into the shadows. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. We jumped inside, slammed the door shut, and Sam floored the accelerator. The engine roared to life, and we sped off, the headlights cutting through the fog. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing behind us, but there was nothing. Just the empty, desolate road. We didn't speak for miles. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, and the fear hadn't subsided. Every time we looked in the rearview mirror, we half expected to see the diner in the distance, but it was gone. Eventually, Sam slowed down, but the tension still lingered. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination, that we had just been too tired and scared. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something about Cindy's diner was off. The next day, when we stopped at a gas station, we decided to ask about the diner. The attendant looked at us with wide eyes when we mentioned the name. "You went there?" he asked, his voice shaking. That place. It's cursed. It's been abandoned for years. Some say it's haunted by the spirits of those who were murdered there. People have gone missing and others who've stopped by never come back. Don't go near it. We didn't need to hear anymore. We understood that we had just narrowly escaped whatever evil lingered at that place. The rest of our trip was a blur. We kept hearing things at night, the faint sound of whispers, footsteps just behind us. But the terror we felt that night never truly left. Months later, I tried to push the memory of Cindy's diner out of my mind. But sometimes when I was alone at night, I would hear that same creepy whisper in the wind. "Come back," it would say. "You can't escape me." And I knew deep down that Cindy's diner would always haunt us. The days passed in a blur after we left that highway. Each of us had tried to return to normal lives, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was watching us. It was a strange, unsettling sensation, one that clung to us long after the journey ended. Sam, once the life of the group, became a shell of himself. He wouldn't talk about the diner, but I could see the fear in his eyes when he was alone. Rachel, too, had changed. She was more jumpy, always looking over her shoulder as if she were afraid the shadow of the diner was just behind her. I tried to tell myself it was just an overreaction. Maybe we had all been tired. Maybe we had been on edge from the long drive. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. There was something dark and malevolent about that place. The way it had felt, the energy in the air, it was something beyond the ordinary, something I couldn't explain. A few weeks later, when I thought I had finally pushed it from my mind, a letter arrived. It was an old-fashioned envelope with no return address, no stamp. Just a plain white envelope that looked as if it had been sitting in a drawer for decades. I tore it open expecting a bill or junk mail, but inside was a single piece of paper, stained with something red. At first I thought it was ink, but then I realized it was blood. I couldn't breathe as I read the message scrawled in jagged handwriting. "You thought you left, but you never will. Come back to Cindy's diner. The shadow waits for you." My hands trembled as I held the letter. It wasn't just some sick prank. The message was clear. It was from the diner. The shadow was calling us again. I tried to laugh it off, dismiss it as a coincidence, but the terror that had gripped me that night resurfaced. I could still hear the woman's laugh echoing in my mind, her twisted smile, the old man's gleaming eyes. It was all too much. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It felt like I was being pulled back there, like some unseen force was guiding me toward that cursed place. I tried to call Sam, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I called Rachel, but she didn't answer either. I knew they were both too scared to talk about it. But I couldn't be alone with this fear any longer. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. That night, I made a decision. I was going back to Cindy's diner. The drive felt longer than it should have. It was as if the road itself was pulling me into the darkness, the fog thicker now than it had ever been. Every mile felt like a weight on my chest, and the closer I got to the diner, the heavier the feeling became. The highway seemed just as deserted as it had been that night. I passed the same stretches of barren land, the same rusted signs, the same twisted trees that seemed to loom like sentinels along the road. The familiar dread crept back into my bones, and I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure lurking behind me. And then I saw it, Cindy's diner, just as it had been, standing alone in the fog, the neon sign flickering in the distance. It looked abandoned, its windows dark, its paint peeling. I hesitated for a moment, but something inside me urged me forward. I pulled into the parking lot, the old sedan's tires screeching against the gravel. The silence around me was suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. But I had to face it. I had to find out what had happened that night. The moment I stepped out of the car, the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. I glanced around nervously, but there was no one else in sight. The diner looked exactly the same, as if it had been frozen in time since my last visit. The sign above the door flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the ground. My breath came out in puffs, visible in the cold night air. I didn't want to go inside. I wanted to turn around and drive away, to forget everything that had happened, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't confront this, I would never be free of the shadow that haunted me. I pushed the door open. The door creaked open slowly, and the sound echoed through the empty diner. The smell of stale food and dust filled the air. The place was just as silent as it had been before, too silent. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled against the worn linoleum floor. The air was thick with the same oppressive feeling of dread that I had felt that night. I was not alone. I could feel it. I looked around, and there he was, the old man. He was standing behind the counter, his face obscured by shadow. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, just as they had before, glowing with that unnatural intensity. He didn't speak, but his smile was enough. A twisted, knowing smile that made my skin crawl. "Welcome back," he said, his voice raspy as if it hadn't been used in years. "I knew you'd come." I froze. His words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to hear what he had to say. I didn't want to know why I was here, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't move. The shadows in the diner seemed to shift, and I turned slowly, my heart racing. And there she was. The woman, the one with the wild hair and blood-soaked face, was standing at the far end of the diner. Her eyes locked onto mine, glowing a deep red, her lips curled into that horrible, twisted smile. She stepped forward, moving unnaturally fast, her feet barely touching the ground. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. "No, this can't be happening," but it was. She advanced toward me, her hands stretched out, claws gleaming in the dim light. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the diner itself was holding me in place, trapping me here. Suddenly, the old man appeared beside me, his hand reaching out to grab my arm. "You can't escape," he hissed. "You're already a part of this place." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. I felt a cold hand wrap around my wrist, pulling me toward the woman. Her face was inches from mine now, and I could see the blood dripping from her eyes. Her grin widened, her teeth sharp and jagged. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered in my ear, her breath cold against my skin. "Now, you belong to me." Just as I thought I would lose my mind from fear, there was a sudden noise, a loud crash followed by the sound of footsteps. Someone was coming. A figure appeared in the doorway, Sam. "Get away from him!" Sam shouted, rushing toward me. He grabbed me by the arm and pulled me away from the woman. The diner seemed to shake, the lights flickering violently as if the building itself were alive. "Run!" Sam shouted, his voice frantic. We didn't hesitate. We bolted toward the door, the woman's laughter echoing behind us. But as we reached the exit, something stopped us. The door wouldn't budge. "No!" I screamed, pounding on the door with my fists. "We need to get out!" The old man was there, standing between us and the door. His eyes glowed brighter now, his grin wider. "It's too late," he said. "You never leave, we were trapped." The diner seemed to close in on us, the walls tightening as if the building were alive. The shadows grew longer, darker, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable chill. The woman was closing in, her claws scraping against the floor, her eyes never leaving us. I could feel the weight of the fear pressing on my chest, suffocating me. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air thick with terror. There was no escape, no way out. This was where we would die, trapped forever in this cursed place. But then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't let this be the end. I couldn't let the shadow win. I turned to Sam. "We need to fight back!" He nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. We searched the diner desperately for something, anything that could help us. My eyes landed on the old matchbook by the counter. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. I grabbed it and struck a match. The flame flickered to life, casting a small golden light in the overwhelming darkness. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice shaking but firm. I held the match high, the tiny flame growing in the shadows. And then, with one last desperate act, I hurled the match at the woman. The match hit the floor, and everything erupted into flames. The diner shook violently, the fire spreading quickly. The woman let out a blood-curdling scream as the flames consumed her, her form disintegrating into the smoke. The old man too shrieked in agony as the fire overtook him. The diner began to collapse, the walls cracking and falling apart as the fire ravaged the building. We ran for the door again, and this time it opened. We stumbled outside, gasping for air as the flames roared behind us. As the diner burned to the ground, I looked back one last time. It was gone. The shadows were gone. The curse had been lifted. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow wasn't truly gone. It would always be with us, lingering in the corners of our minds. Some fears never truly fade, and some stories never end.